thank you to the Downtown Association for the use of the facility and putting this together. Thank you to the St. Andrews Society, of course, for the whiskey, which will vastly improve my performance and hopefully your enjoyment of it. To the First Families of New York, and of course to the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society for all that they do to raise awareness of someone. Without them, I just don't know that anyone would have heard of Alexander Hamilton these days. I kid. I will not be singing tonight because unlike Alexander Hamilton, Richard, Jake, and well, seemingly everyone else involved, I am not a capable singer. So I will spare you that, as there is not nearly enough whiskey that the St. Andrews Society could provide to make that a good idea. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about one of the lasting and, shall we say, immediately salient intellectual legacies of Alexander Hamilton, and that is a subject that no one's really discussing these days: impeachment. As is commonly known, Alexander Hamilton was probably the greatest exponent of executive power and highly influential in shaping the modern presidency, both at Philadelphia at the convention and then, of course, afterwards as the de facto prime minister of Washington's administration. And so people generally think of him as perhaps even a reflexive apologist for executive power, and in many respects it is correct that he saw the essential nature of a strong presidency to the young republic, but he also happened to be the person who came to the Philadelphia Convention with the most, I won't necessarily say the clearest, but the most and ultimately most influential ideas about how to remove a president or anyone else who was misbehaving in office. And as a result, although he is much discussed these days, no one has talked that much about what is probably his greatest legacy within the text of the Constitution itself, the impeachment provisions. Impeachment is an odd part of the Constitution. It's odd because it has relatively few applicable predicates in either classical sort of Roman and Greek Republican ideas and also in English law. There's several reasons for this. The ancient solutions for removing a bad executive were numerous, but not all of them, shall we say, suited to task. Part of it was that the ancients heavily relied on things that would, they hoped, prevent corruption or misbehavior by executives, things like lot drawing offices at random, very short terms of office, things like year-long terms, and then being voted on by the citizenry. And many of the newly independent states did try at least one of these. They used the lot for juries and militias. Juries and militias were much more common back then than they are now, obviously. And short terms were sort of the name of the game immediately after the Revolution. The governorship of Virginia had a one-year term until, well, for about the first 15 years of its existence, and as you can imagine, that wasn't a great idea. Thomas Jefferson was briefly the governor, Patrick Henry was briefly the governor, no one was not briefly the governor. Everyone wound up suffering, I think. Administration certainly suffered as a result of brevity. The second most common tool that the ancients brought to dealing with matters that might invite impeachment was banishment. Banishment in a city-state makes a lot of sense. You can kick somebody out. There's somewhere else they can go to live, not that far away. Banishment in the United States in the late 18th century doesn't make a lot of sense. It's either a death sentence or totally impracticable. You can't enforce it in an extended agrarian republic, or you're just sending someone off into the wilderness to die. Seems a little harsh from a punishment standpoint. And so the Americans sort of walked away from the classical tradition of punishing maladministration. They also didn't have a lot to draw on from the English tradition. There had been impeachment in England and under English law, but it was a haphazard affair and not of long, shall we say, not of long vintage. The English looked to some extent to the continental tradition, and certainly a Scot like Hamilton would not have been unfamiliar with the provisions in Roman law for dealing with removing people from office or punishing maladministration. But because, despite the attempts of some Tudor reformers and Stuart reformers to make an absolute monarchy of England, they never had an absolute monarchy and thus weren't able to kind of fully integrate those provisions. Instead, what you get from the English model is this mix of office holding and property rights. You have a very strong tradition of property rights in the English common law, and offices come to be seen as an extension of property rights. So if I have an office, I have a property in that office, right? That I may only hold that property under conditions, i.e. a term of service of so many years, a term until good behavior, a term until the king gets mad at me. All of these are sort of options. But I have a right in the office that is anchored in property. And what this does is, well, to put it simply, is it creates a confusion, what we might call a sanguinary confusion. When you confuse property rights with office holding, then the analogy you have for removing someone from office is expropriation of property. And the crimes that people have to commit to be expropriated in the English common law are very few, specifically treason. And the punishment for treason is capital punishment. As you can imagine, that elevates the stakes for office holders pretty considerably. And what this led to under the Tudors and the Stuarts was a fairly bloody internecine feud within their elite as they modernized the English state over who was going to control the king, or at least advise the king and create administration. The names of the people who sort of fell prey to this cycle are well enough known, but we can certainly rehearse some of them. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Henry Norris, more Boleyns than we can count, roughly an equal number of Seymours, quite a few people named Grey, John Dudley, Walter Raleigh. Nobody even knows how many bishops. I mean, you wind up with a situation where being in power in the Tudor and then Stuart monarchy is a recipe for self-endangerment. And ultimately, of course, as we get into the middle of the 17th century, this process of elite competition metastasizes into the English Civil War. And the English Civil War looms large in the background, in the imagination of the framers. They see it as an ambivalent experience. They recognize that it's a great strike against tyranny and consolidated power, ostensibly for the sake of liberty. But they also see that it spirals out of control into its own tyranny. By 1688, we get the Glorious Revolution, and that checks some of the more atavistic tendencies of the previous 2 centuries and elite competition during that age. We also get, however, 2 new critical ideas that are going to sit in the front of Hamilton's mind when he's getting ready to go to Philadelphia. I'm going to talk in a minute about his personal experience that drives a lot of this, but these 2 ideas, along with the fear of things cycling out of control, sit front and center in his mind. The first is corruption, and the second is the danger of the spirit of faction. Now, it may seem odd to describe corruption as an idea, right? Isn't corruption a given thing? Isn't it just something that exists in the world? Well, it is and it is not. What we mean by corruption, specifically, is that there has developed by the late 17th century and into the first half of the 18th century, a general recognition of the concept of the general good, that there's a sort of common good, and that people in the service of the sovereign are charged with not simply executing the sovereign's will or acting on behalf of their provincial or personal interest, but for the sake of the common good. And so when I talk about this idea of corruption, what I'm talking about is the notion of using the state or using one's office within the state to self-aggrandize, self-enrich, or otherwise suborn the public good for one's own sake. The great Tory politician Henry St. John, the first Viscount Bolingbroke, very curious and charismatic figure. He winds up getting exiled, he comes back, he publishes a newspaper, leads a very exciting life, draws a contrast between what becomes his country party ideology of sort of Tory, high Tory politics, with the Walpole administration that he sees as personalistic, corrupt, self-enriching, and generally taking the will of the monarch, the sovereign, and turning it away from what is in the interest of the general good. Whether or not he had the right idea about what the general good is not the question, but taking it and turning it towards selfish and parochial interests. And what this means is that agrarian politics, when it emerges from England in the 1730s and has a major influence on the minds of the founders, most of whom were born in the 1730s and 1740s, it mixes agrarian politics, this idea of the politics of people who live in the country and own farms, right? And that's the overwhelming majority of people in the 13 colonies going into the Revolution, with skepticism of centralized authority, vigilance for ulterior motives behind public officials' acts, and worries about the venal subordination of the general good to the service of personal enrichment. We get that mainly from the Country Party and Bolingbroke. At the same time, we have a group of writers who are very different. These are sort of more down-market writers, so to speak. Socially, they're not Viscounts. They're what are known as the Commonwealth men. They're an intellectual movement that's more urban in its base, and they reach back to James Harrington, a writer from 50 years previously, and then further back to Niccolo Machiavelli. And they're the ones who really breathe republicanism, this idea of a republic, into English political thought and English political life. The most famous work from this period is by two men, Trenchard and Gordon, called Cato's Letters. I'm sure everyone here has heard of it. And the Commonwealth men are an important body of thinkers because they take this idea of republicanism, which Harrington has matched to property ownership. He's someone, and Locke as well. He's connected the idea of Republican citizenship to owning property. And they also then link that to agrarianism, right? So what they say is to be a citizen in a republic is to own property. Combinations of property are inevitably going to be suspect unless those interests are combined with the interest of the whole, right? And so what we have in effect between the Country Party and the Commonwealth men is an amalgam of ideas about ownership, land, corruption, and republicanism, and that's kind of the ferment, the stew that a lot of the founders come out of. And Hamilton, although a foreigner and an immigrant who didn't grow up in the same sort of arena as his peers in the Revolution, is very steeped in this. He's also steeped in the Scottish Enlightenment by way of various and sundry influences. But so this is the world in which corruption, consolidation, these ideas are highly present. What breathes energy into them is this fear that the great agent of corruption is faction, party, partisanship. We don't have at this point an idea of parties as ideological movements organized around competing visions of the general good. These aren't people saying we should do X with policy versus Y with policy. They're much more personalistic. They're based around patronage. They're based around the dispensing of honors. We need Edmund Burke to get that idea, and Burke, of course, will write most of that during and after the Revolution, and so he doesn't have much of an influence on people. What instead we get is the anti-Machiavellian strain of Republican thought that says republics lose when they fight internally amongst themselves, that factions lead to dissipation, they lead to foreign conquest, they lead to the end of Republican government. And so what England leaves to the framers and to Hamilton, who will be the one who thinks about this most seriously, as he goes to the Philadelphia Convention, is a problem, an obvious problem, this problem of corruption, this problem of factional conflict, and this problem of removing officers or punishing them if they misbehave, but no clear answer, because the only consistent answer England's come up with is cutting people's heads off, and we've decided we don't want to do that anymore, thankfully. Where then does this leave Hamilton? Well, the most important thing about Alexander Hamilton going into Philadelphia is that he is a veteran of the Revolution. That may sound trite, but it's extremely important to keep this in mind, because Hamilton is simultaneously a successful revolutionary, a very rare breed indeed, and also profoundly concerned not to see another revolution take place. Not for any purely reactionary motive, but simply because if you look around the neighborhood in the end of the 18th century as an American, newly independent, what you see are much larger, much more powerful, and frankly avaricious European empires who would love nothing more than to divide up and conquer the newly independent United States. As Franklin stylized in his famous cartoon of a snake cut into multiple pieces, the states really had two options: join or die. And yet, these revolutionaries, having themselves deployed the English revolutionary tradition, dating back to the Bishop John Ponnet, who had fled to the continent under Bloody Mary, all the way, if not going all the way back to Runnymede and the Barons' Rebellion, they had let loose into the public imagination the idea that revolution was a solution to problems. So here, these people have used revolution to set themselves free, and yet in doing so, they've created a revolutionary body politic that they don't want to continue staging revolutions every 20 years because, one, revolutions tend to be bloody affairs, and two, if you really think faction is a bad idea, a revolutionary faction invariably will invite in the British, the French, the Spanish, or someone else to chop up the newly independent states and subordinate them. And so what Hamilton is tangling with is how to ensure justice and liberty without the resort to what Locke would call the appeal to heaven, the resort to violence, the attempt at revolution. The influence of Locke is overstated on the founders, but I think certainly his view of revolution is apt. And Hamilton distills this anxiety in Federalist 69, in fact seems to echo Locke, although I suspect by way of Blackstone, when he says, "The person of the King of Great Britain is sacred and inviolable. There is no constitutional tribunal to which he is amenable, no punishment to which he can be subjected without involving the crisis of a national revolution." So here's the challenge. How, when we have someone entrusted with the laws, engaged in law breaking, do we remove that person within the law without reverting to violence that puts the entire system of law in question? Conversely, how do we create that system with enough guardrails that a spirited faction possessed of a maniacal single-mindedness and a desire to avenge itself on someone who's won an election, how do we keep them from creating one series of national crises, one after the next? That is to say that removal or impeachment or whatever the method winds up being has to be sufficiently burdensome that it's not taken on lightly, but efficacious enough that criminality can be rightly punished. The second major factor, beyond these fears that the war crystallized, is the actual lived experience of being in the war and in the army. Hamilton, of course, starts his martial career on this island and rises to the level of a general. He would have been very familiar with the chaotic early days of the war, where units were batched together, many of them elected their own officers, and these systems were even formalized because the United States doesn't have a professional staff really to speak of until the late 19th century within its armies. So, the privates get together and they elect their sergeants, and the sergeants get together and they elect their officers, and the officers draw lots to decide who's going to be colonel and who's going to be major and whatnot. I mean, I'm not making that up. This is how it was done in Pennsylvania, and you held your office for 3 years, and then they cycled you out again, and if your men didn't like you, you didn't get reelected. Washington, for what it's worth, saw this was complete madness and chaos and did everything he could to get rid of it, but that's another story. Hamilton is very familiar with the idea of the needfulness of executive power and an executive power insulated from moments of fear, collective anxiety, or panic, right? I mean, if you can have your privates voting out your colonels every time the colonel says, guys, we got to go, take that hill, that's going to be a problem. On the flip side, if the colonel is pilfering, which happened a lot, that's also going to be a problem. And, what winds up happening is informal systems of sanction appear within the army. One of these, after the war, a group of veterans, also from Pennsylvania, you might be getting a hint of a theme here. Some Pennsylvanian veterans are disgruntled, they haven't been paid for a long time, and they mutiny. Two of their officers have kind of stoked this thing, and they wound up heading into Pennsylvania. They're in the central part of the state. They march on Pennsylvania. They go down to the State House where Congress is meeting, and they occupy it. Bayonets fixed to that whole thing. They show up and they say, pay us, we're not leaving. It's basically our first bonus army. And Congress goes, guys, let's talk about this. You can put the bayonet down, it's fine. We'll get you paid, we promise, but you got to disperse here because we can't be, the kind of government where people just show up with a battalion and take over the Congress and say, pay us or else. That has some deleterious side effects. And so they start to scatter, and then they receive a rather draconian message from the federal government, hints immediately afterwards decamps from Philadelphia to the suburbs, saying, oh, and by the way, if you don't quit and put down your guns, we're going to hang all of you. And so they agree to stop mutinying, and their 2 officers flee to London immediately. They jump on boats and head to London. Well, this brings disgrace upon the entire claim of the unit that mutinied in the first place, so they immediately impeach their officers in absentia. They hold a court-martial and they vote to impeach them for, essentially dereliction of duty, mutiny, yada, yada, yada. Hamilton, who was an observer of these proceedings, wrote in a letter to George Clinton, the removal and a proclamation by the president announcing to the mutineers that extremities would be pursued against them, it's a nice euphemism for hanging them, have intimidated them into submission. They have impeached 2 of their officers who have immediately fled to London. But I think the longest shadow over the impeachment debate, at least in Hamilton's imagination, was cast by Benedict Arnold. We have a habit of making alabaster statues of the founders. They were not. They were flesh and blood people. Many of them lived colorful lives, to say the least. Certainly Alexander Hamilton did. He was, by no means an angel, and he certainly, he literally published a small pamphlet telling the world about it. But Benedict Arnold had been the bosom companion of these people in revolution, a literal brother in arms. And when he gave up West Point, or attempted to give up West Point and flee to the British, to the public it had this effect of catalyzing a revolutionary cause and binding people together and seeing in Britain a certain degree of treachery. For the elite around Washington, it was a hugely traumatic event. Not only did they feel that they'd been successfully bamboozled, but they arrested Major John Andre, this sort of charming, dashing figure who was the spy master of the British forces in the Americas and who had recruited Arnold. And Andre had not really done anything technically to deserve hanging per se. It's unclear that he was dressed as a spy when he was picked up by a couple of pickets. But it was Hamilton's view, it was Washington's view at the time, and Hamilton concurred with it, even though he became very fond of Andre during the couple of days while he was in custody, that someone was going to hang. It was either going to be Andre or Arnold, and Arnold, having slipped out of the Americans' grasp, Andre wound up hanging. Shortly thereafter, on October 11th, Hamilton sent a letter to Lieutenant Colonel John Lorenz, and he says that his mind, quote, has been wholly occupied by the affecting and tragic consequences of Arnold's treason. My feelings were never put to so severe a trial. And this is a person who's been in war for multiple years at this point, and this is the moment that sort of shakes him foundationally. Of course, Hamilton is aghast at the fact that they've had to hang Andre, but he's also just simply distressed that even a person of high station in whom immense public trust is been placed like Benedict Arnold would betray everyone, and for little more than a commission. At the same time, Hamilton is also at this point well rehearsed in the venality of politicians and the risk of political corruption. From the outset of the Revolutionary War, and this is not surprising to anyone who's studied revolutions, self-dealing, theft, corruption, bribery, all of these things were wanton problems. It turns out when the organized rule of law breaks down, people don't bring their best selves to the table all the time. In particular, a fellow named Samuel Chase, who was a delegate to the Continental Congress from Maryland, got together with some buddies and, using insider information, decided to try to corner the flour market. I don't mean W, I mean O-U-R. The Americans were trying to get a flour supply to the French fleet so that they could stay active and effective, and what Chase did was leak this information to some of his buddies who tried to corner the flour market, raise prices, and then sell it all to the federal government. Hamilton was instrumental in surfacing this, this treachery, and he wrote 3 Publius letters at the end of 1778 just damning Chase in no uncertain terms. In his first letter, which is from October 16th of that year, he wrote, quote, "When a man appointed to be the guardian of the state and the depositary of the happiness and morals of the people, forgetful of the solemn relation in which he stands, descends to the dishonest artifices of a mercantile projector, and sacrifices his conscience and his trust to pecuniary motives, there is no strain of abhorrence of which the human mind is capable, nor punishment the vengeance of the people can inflict, which may not be applied to him with justice. If it should have happened that a member of Congress has been this degenerate character and has been known to turn the knowledge of secrets to which his office gave him access to the purposes of private profit by employing emissaries to engross an article of immediate necessity to the public service, he ought to feel the utmost rigor of public resentment and be detested as a traitor of the worst and most dangerous kind. You know, he's being subtle. Political corruption is very real. They know about it. They live it. They see it all the time. Hamilton especially was aware that, you know, powerful interests inclined to their own self-interest and that they had to be brought into the political system. This, in many respects, is the essence of his dispute with Madison. Madison thinks they can be contained. Hamilton believes they have to be co-opted. And so it's this body of ideas and this set of personal experiences that he brings with him to Philadelphia when he goes to the Constitutional Convention. Hamilton, as it's well known, brings a sort of detailed and lengthy, but I would say incomplete or unrefined structure of government that he proposes. It's more a list of ideas. They're interconnected and they're self-referencing. They're broken up into 6 articles. It's not that it's not a detailed or well thought out document, but it doesn't compare to the Virginia plan that Madison shows up with, which is much more precise and organized. And it deals with impeachment in a dozen sections, and indeed it's the primary, what distinguishes it from anybody else's proposals before the convention is the extent to which it deals with impeachment. And 4 of Hamilton's principles wind up getting integrated into the eventual Constitution. The first is that legislative chambers will choose their own officers and make their own rules without interference. That may seem, you know, a rather esoteric issue, but I think we've seen of late that it matters who decides within a chamber. Most importantly, and this is something where I think Hamilton was uniquely a visionary among his generation, political punishments, i.e. impeachments, cannot extend to life or limb. So contrast that to what he writes in 1778 when he says he ought to feel the utmost rigor of public resentment and be detested as a traitor of the worst and most dangerous kind. He doesn't say hanged as a traitor. He says detested as a traitor. Right? Public reputation, political punishments for political crimes. There can be normal law and order afterwards, but we don't execute people for maladministration or political crimes in this country. And that is truly a Hamiltonian contribution. He also is the first person to propose supermajorities of 2/3 of the decisive legislators present being needed to impeach and remove someone. And he also is, as far as I'm aware, the origin of the idea that judicial impeachments should be treated the same as the impeachments of executive officers. And for Hamilton also, senators are subject to impeachment. That is subsequently changed. One key provision that Hamilton proposes actually is not adopted. He makes, well, 2, I suppose. The first is he proposes that the president, once impeached, should be suspended from office until his impeachment is resolved. Given that both chambers and a bicameral legislature make their own rules, I think we can see how that would be a problem if you could have one chamber say, I'm just making this up, this is just me speaking, you know, hypothetically here, a chamber could impeach a president and then not transmit the articles to the other chamber. That would, you know, effectively suspend a presidential administration without a decision. Especially one with a supermajority rule. The other one that's a little more bizarre is he proposes that impeachments be tried by 6 justices of the Supreme Court and a random lottery of 6 senators. He attenuates this to just say that they're going to do a provisional read on whether or not there are grounds for impeachment. So they kind of are, they're not even really the grand jury. They're kind of the, I don't know, like what the French have as prosecuting judges. But he wants the 6 justices of the Supreme Court and then a random draw of 6 senators. One can only imagine the chaos that would follow, and he does drop it at Philadelphia. In fact, I think the only person, Hamilton is gone on July 20th when the convention debates impeachment, but Edmund Randolph, who was sort of a curious fellow, had picked up Hamilton's plan and actually really liked this idea of an impeachment court and proposed it. And if you read Madison's notes, he sort of proposes it, and then there's this silence. Everyone's just like, you're kidding. Really? All right. The other element I think that Hamilton rightly sees sits in tension with his first principle that legislative chambers get to set their own rules is he tries to put a precision requirement on impeachments. He says that impeachments have to, quote, clearly specify the particular offense for which the party accused is to be tried. That, of course, doesn't come to pass. What we now have is a system that he embraces and defends rigorously in the Federalist, where impeachment is what the legislature makes it. And I think that that's a moment of interesting growth in Hamilton. We don't think of him as the over-formalist. He's not a lawyer. He is a lawyer, I'm sorry. He's not a lawyerly sort of person when it comes to structures of power. He's not inclined to over-determine power. He's much more someone who says, let's have realms of authority and let people act according to their authority. And when the debate is joined on impeachment, both officially on July 20th and then unofficially, what winds up happening is a much more open textured, open-ended grant of authority to Congress than what Hamilton had envisioned. And that's what he winds up vigorously defending in the Federalist. And I think it's in the Federalist, in three of his essays in the 60s, 65, 66, and 69, where we see Hamilton really come into his own as an exponent of the vision of congressional adjudication that the Constitution ultimately comes to include. We know, of course, from his plan that he wanted a much more precise, much more formalistic, multi-layered system. I think certainly Hamilton believed that impeachment was going to be a common part of our politics, and he worried about it. But he ultimately concludes that the Senate, meeting as a whole, is adequate to the task of trying impeachments. And he says something, and I'm going to quote at length here in Federalist 65, which I think, bear in mind that this is a Federalist paper. This is not something someone wrote this week. Quote, "A well-constituted court for the trial of impeachments is an object not more to be desired than difficult to be obtained in a government wholly elective. The subjects of its jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or, in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may with peculiar propriety be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. The prosecution of them for this reason will seldom fail to agitate the passions of the whole community, and to divide it into parties, more or less friendly or inimical to the accused. In many cases, it will connect itself with the pre-existing factions and will enlist all their animosities, partialities, influence, and interest on one side or on the other. And in such cases, there will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of the parties than by the real demonstrations of innocence or guilt." I don't think I could actually have phrased it better, but a remarkably prescient statement on his part. There is one final tidbit, though, about Hamilton and impeachment that I think is worth discussing, an ironic one. 3 years after killing Hamilton, Aaron Burr oversees the first attempted impeachment of a Supreme Court justice. That justice was Samuel Chase of Maryland, the fellow who'd gotten wrapped up in the flower racket. Anyway, with that, I'll take any questions. It's relatively rare by any standard of certainly any post-colonial presidentialist system. Argentina for a while there, it was like people were just getting the drapes measured and the next guy was coming in after them. What's distinctive about the United States is that for all of the dark spots in our history where the Constitution hasn't been followed because expedience and convenience has made it easier to trample on process, liberty, freedom, basic human dignity, the list goes on, we really have cared about having elections every 2 years, every 4 years, for senators every 6 years. And so the fact of the semi-annual election hasn't been violated. And unlike most governments, when someone resigns, we don't then have another election. So in a lot of other constitutional presidentialist systems, what happens is people go out to the street, they protest, they build up enough political pressure that the president resigns and a snap election is held. Well, after the corrections made to the succession system in the wake of the Burr plot, if you impeach the president, you're getting the vice president who probably agrees with him. So it builds into the system a certain amount of patience. Additionally, the fact that we've had more or less the constant peaceful rotation of office in this country for the entire history, I think, has made the urgency of impeachment seem a little less acute. I mean, as anyone who's read any newspaper in the last 3 months can hear, there's an argument out there that says we're having another election in November, let's let the people figure it out. And the security of American elections, I think, is part of why it's so rare. To the second question, I think that it's safe to say no. They generally don't discriminate among the authors, at least not officially or formally. When it comes to using historical documentation as a guide, public meaning originalists, that is to say people who believe that the way to interpret the Constitution is as the words would have been understood by the people who ratified it, will use prominent documents to say, see, this is what they would have meant at that time. And so the Federalist Papers do get used by judges like that, but certainly it depends. The short answer to that is I don't know. Polarization exists in no small part because we can't decide as a country what we want. Well, we've decided we want a lot. We don't really want to pay for it, and we want some things that we don't want to give to other people. And there's an amount of the normal give and take of politics in that. But it is certainly true that, prior to the 1970s, we'd only have one president impeached, and he was only president because of John Wilkes Booth, and it was in the wake of a civil war, where 35% of the country was under military occupation, so it's a slightly different set of conditions. And then, from Watergate accelerating up to the present, we've impeached three presidents out of the last, 7? So 8, that's a lot, or at least have been on the path towards it. I think there are two ways that people interpret this. One is we have the luxury of impeachment these days because, we're the global hegemon, things are pretty good. So there's one way to say, lucky us, we get to deal with, factional hatred and impeachment. Another, I think, way to view it is that, mass party politics is just something that the framers are blind to. It's a huge blind spot. Parties aren't integrated into the Constitution in any way, shape, or form. They sit in a weird legal limbo as non-governmental entities that are ostensibly non-profit organizations, but not quite. And so, impeachment, Hamilton, as I read in Federalist 65, there seems to be the only person who's not blind to the extent to which organized political competition, which we're seeing at this time when he's writing between friends and enemies of the Constitution, poses real risks to the ability to use this as a punishment. And I think the second short answer I'll give you, now that I've given you a short answer, I don't know, and a long answer that's rambled, is they messed up, and there's not a really good way out. The Senate tried to impeach one of its own members early on, and then they were like, wait a second, we set our own rules. Why are we impeaching? And also the House does impeachments, hang on. So what wound up happening is there's in constitutional law this delineation between legislators and officers of the United States. Legislators are different creatures. Officers are either executive branch or judicial officials, and so only they can be subject to impeachment and removal as an exercise of power by the legislature. There's this myth out there that we have 3 co-equal branches. We don't have 3 co-equal branches, all right? If I can fire you and you can't fire me, we're not equal. I may be disorganized, lazy, and hate myself and be incapable of acting. That doesn't mean I'm not still your boss, right? And so an indolent legislature that declines to fire executive or judicial people is still in charge. The Congress is the supreme branch, right? They can kick out any member of any other branch that they feel like. They can change their salaries, and they can initiate constitutional amendments. That's a one-way street. It doesn't go the other way. We've had some judges impeached, including one who's now an elected member of Congress from Florida, Alcee Hastings, who voted in favor of impeaching the president, which is a first in American history, someone impeached then voting on an impeachment. I think that's a fun bit of trivia, but I don't get out that much. In terms of people getting impeached, we've kicked out quite a few judges for senility, corruption, things like that, about, a dozen maybe, I don't know the number off the top of my head, over the last couple hundred years. And then, of course, everybody knows about the presidents. Legislatures generally don't remove themselves because people tend to get booted either by their party, which serves as a removal function that hadn't been anticipated, or by the FBI, like Duncan Hunter, where they said, all right, you can resign and we won't send you to prison. There have been votes to remove. I think the last successful vote to remove was, someone can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but the congressman from Ohio with the bad hair, Jim Traficant, was I think the last one who was removed, but I may be wrong about that. I think absolutely parties. I think he's the one who sees it coming, but he can't quite put his hand on it or see the shape of it. And of course he dies in 1804, and so he doesn't experience the sort of quasi-party system of the Federalists against the Republicans, and only John Quincy Adams really lives long enough to see the rise of Jeffersonianism, or not Jefferson, Jacksonianism. I think parties would be it. He knew there was there, he could see the shape of it, but he couldn't sort of see the color dimensions or analyze it, and I think that would be what he would try to figure out a problem for, is how do we make the parties responsible for their own quality control? You vote them out. Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to hold members of Congress accountable is to vote them out. The largest primary electorates for Congress are about 90 to 100,000 people. The most recent, in the 5 boroughs, the most recent, shock primary win when the Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez beat Joe Crowley, who was at that time the 4th most powerful Democrat in the House. She only got 16,000 votes. That was it. He got 12,000. Query what kind of person can run a county political machine in this city and only turn out 12,000 voters, but that's a different discussion. I don't want to put words in his mouth. Hamilton was emphatically a political person, and so I think it would depend on which side of the question he was on and what the politics of it were. I suspect if he was convinced that there was wrongdoing, he would call that a matter of pure political prudence. If there was, I don't believe that he would have gone forward, especially given what happened to him with the publicization of his extramarital affair and various and sundry things. I don't think he would have gone in on an impeachment where no real wrongdoing had taken place or where no illegality had taken place. I don't think he would have done that. But certainly if he thought it was good politics, he'd have gone in for it. But mostly with an eye to winning the election. I think the most important thing to understand about impeachment is that it's a political case, but it's also a constitutional case. And so what you have to balance what we have to ask of our legislators is this. One, did a real crime take place? And that is not itself a sufficient condition, I hate to say it, for impeachment. We've had lots of criminal presidents, right? In fact, most presidents at some point break the law. It's not enough to say, you are a lawbreaker, I'm going to impeach you. I could run down 3 or 4 things that every one of the last 4 or 5 presidents did that on paper justified impeachment. What matters is doing this, is the crime so overwhelming that a normal political remedy is inadequate to the task? And if we do this and we don't succeed, we don't persuade the public, have we merely driven deeper rifts within the public? And I think those are prudential questions that every legislator has to ask and has to answer for themselves. But I think as citizens, what we can do is demand that prudence rather than the spirit of faction or the vain desire to be on cable news driving people's decisions. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everybody.